The shuttle doors opened with a soft hiss, and Maggie Cole stepped onto the cold metal floor of Viridian Prime. She was 17 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and the first human to ever attend the Academy of Martial Sciences. The weight of that fact pressed down on her shoulders as she walked through the arrival hall. Aliens of every shape and size filled the massive space. The Torvani were the most common tall reptilian creatures with 4 arms and scales that shifted color with their moods. They moved with the confidence of a species that had ruled this sector of space for thousands of years. The Scythe floated past her like living ghosts, their translucent bodies glowing with soft inner light. In one corner, a group of Kreth warriors were arm wrestling. Their massive gray bodies, covered in thick muscle and natural armor plating every single one of them stopped to stare at the human girl. Maggie kept her eyes forward and her face calm. She had expected this. Back on Earth, the news channels had warned her that aliens did not think much of humanity. Humans had only discovered faster-than-light travel 8 years ago, to species that had been traveling between stars for tens of thousands of years. Humans were like children who had just learned to walk. A Torvani official approached her, his scales flickering between green and yellow. He held a data tablet in 2 of his hands while the other 2 hung at his sides. "You are the human exchange student," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my name is Maggie Cole." The official did not introduce himself. He simply turned and began walking, expecting her to follow. Maggie picked up her single bag of belongings and hurried after him. The academy was built into the heart of a massive space station. Corridors stretched in every direction, lined with doors that led to classrooms, training halls, and dormitories. Everything was built for beings much larger than Maggie. The stairs were too tall, the doors too heavy, and the temperature was cold enough to make her breath visible in the air. The official stopped in front of a small door at the end of a maintenance corridor. "Your quarters," he said, and walked away without another word. Maggie opened the door and found a room barely larger than a closet. There was a thin mattress on a metal frame, a small locker, and nothing else. A single light panel in the ceiling provided weak illumination. The walls were bare metal, and she could hear the hum of machinery through them. She set her bag on the bed and sat down. The mattress was hard and cold. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the loneliness that had been building since she left Earth. She was millions of light years from home, surrounded by aliens who did not want her here. And she had 3 years of study ahead of her. Then she thought about her grandmother. Martha Cole had survived things that would have broken most people. She had grown up poor, worked her way through school, and built a life for her family through sheer determination. When Maggie was young, her grandmother had told her stories about their ancestors, people who had faced impossible challenges and refused to give up. "You come from survivors," her grandmother had said. "No matter what happens, you keep going. That is what we do." Maggie wiped her eyes and stood up. She had work to do. The next morning, she reported to the forge hall for her first class. The hall was enormous, filled with furnaces that burned hot enough to melt starship hulls. Workstations were arranged in rows, each one equipped with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum of alien technology. Heat shimmered in the air, and the smell of hot metal filled her lungs. Instructor Varric stood at the front of the hall. He was a Torvani elder. His scales faded to a dull gray with age. His forearms were thick with muscle, and his eyes were hard as stone. 40 students stood before him, representing the best young smiths from a dozen worlds and one human girl. Varric began the class with a lecture on the history of weapon forging. He spoke of techniques that had been developed over 60,000 years, of alloys that could only be created in the hearts of dying stars, of blades that could cut through anything in the known universe. His voice was deep and commanding, and every student listened with complete attention. except Maggie was having trouble following. The technical terms were unfamiliar, and the concepts were far beyond anything she had learned on Earth. Human metalworking was primitive compared to this. She was starting from nothing. After the lecture, the students moved to their workstations for practical exercises. Maggie found her assigned station in the back corner of the hall, the smallest and most poorly equipped spot in the room. The tools were old and worn, and the furnace connection was weak. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to find Gorthuk, the biggest crest in the class, standing beside her station. His gray skin was covered in ritual scars, and his small eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "The human thinks she can be a smith," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What will you make, little creature? A pointed stick?" Laughter rippled through the hall. Even some of the instructors smiled. Maggie looked at Gorthuk calmly. "I guess we will find out." Gorthuk snorted and walked away. But Maggie noticed that his hands were clenched into fists. He had expected her to cry or run away. Her calm response had confused him. "Good," she thought. "Let them underestimate me." That evening, she went to the academy library. It was a vast chamber filled with holographic displays and data crystals containing knowledge from 1,000 worlds. The librarian was an elderly Torvani named Mirren, whose scales had turned completely white with age. "I need to learn everything about metallurgy," Maggie told her. From the beginning, Mirren looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Child, Torvani children begin their metallurgical education at age 5. They study for 20 years before they are considered ready for basic forge work. You cannot hope to catch up." "Then I better start now," Maggie said. She stayed in the library until the station's artificial lights dimmed for the night cycle. Then she returned to her tiny room and studied more. When her eyes grew too tired to read, she practiced the basic hand movements she had observed in class. When her arms grew too tired to move, she lay on her hard bed and visualized the techniques in her mind. She slept for 4 hours. Then she got up and did it all again. Days passed, then weeks. The other students continued to mock her. Instructor Varric barely acknowledged her existence. Her practical exercises were clumsy, and her results were poor. But every day, she was a little bit better than the day before, and in the back of her mind, she could hear her grandmother's voice, reminding her of who she was and where she came from. Survivors. That is what we are. 2 months had passed since Maggie arrived at the academy. She had learned more about metalworking in those 8 weeks than most humans learned in a lifetime. But she was still far behind her alien classmates. The gap between her skills and theirs seemed impossible to close. Then Instructor Varric made an announcement that changed everything. "Your midterm examination will determine your future at this academy," he said, standing at the center of the forge hall. His forearms were folded across his chest, and his scales had turned a deep shade of purple, a sign of serious intent. "Each of you will forge a blade. The design, materials, and techniques are your choice. You have 3 standard days to complete the task." The students murmured with excitement. This was the examination that everyone talked about. The student who created the best blade would earn a place in the advanced class, taught by Grandmaster Torin himself. Torin was a legend among smiths. His weapons were displayed in museums across the galaxy. To study under him was the highest honor the academy could offer. Varric's cold eyes found Maggie in the crowd. "All students will participate. There are no exceptions." The other students immediately rushed toward the supply rooms. The academy provided raw materials for examinations, but the best supplies were limited. The fastest and strongest students would claim the premium alloys, the rare crystals, and the exotic compounds that could make the difference between a good blade and a great one. Maggie did not rush. She knew she could not compete with the Kreth warriors in a physical contest for supplies. By the time she reached the supply room, the shelves were nearly empty. The premium materials were gone. Even the standard supplies had been picked clean. She walked through the room slowly, examining what remained. There were bent pieces of starship hull, contaminated by radiation exposure. There were cracked crystals that had failed quality testing. There were scraps of metal too small or too flawed for serious work. And in a dusty corner, she found a box labeled Organic Waste, Disposal Pending. Inside the box were bones. Not human bones or Tovani bones, but something else entirely. The bones were a pale gray color, dense and heavy despite their size. They had been used in some previous experiment and then discarded. Maggie picked up one of the bones and examined it closely. It was unlike any material she had ever seen. The surface was smooth but not slippery, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. There was something almost alive about it. She took the box back to her workstation. Korthik saw what she was carrying and burst out laughing. His booming voice echoed through the forge hall. "Look at the human. She's going to make a bone knife like her primitive ancestors. Perhaps she will paint herself with mud and dance around the fire too." The other students joined in the laughter. Even Priestess Verlaine, the most talented Silithy in the class, allowed herself a small smile of contempt. Maggie ignored them all. She had learned that reacting to their mockery only encouraged more of it. Instead, she carried her box to the library. Mirren the librarian watched her approach with curiosity. "What have you found there, child?" "I do not know," Maggie admitted, "but I want to find out." She spent the next 6 hours researching. The Academy's database contained information on millions of materials from across the galaxy. Most of them were metals and alloys, the traditional materials of weaponsmithing. But there was also a section on organic materials, substances derived from living creatures. That was where she found her answer. The bones in her box came from a creature called a Void Stalker. The Void Stalker was a predator that lived in the empty space between star systems, surviving in conditions that would kill any other known life form. Its skeleton had evolved over millions of years to withstand the crushing pressures and extreme temperatures of deep space. Maggie read the entry 3 times to make sure she understood correctly. The Void Stalker's bone was denser than most metals. It was resistant to heat, cold, radiation, and even energy weapons. In theory, it was one of the strongest materials in the galaxy, but there was a problem. The database entry noted that Void Stalker bone was considered impossible to work with. The material was so dense that it could not be cut by conventional tools. It was so heat-resistant that normal furnaces could not soften it. Every attempt to forge it into a weapon had failed. The bones in the disposal box were the remnants of those failed attempts. Maggie sat back in her chair and thought about what she had learned. The other students had access to the finest materials in the galaxy, crafted specifically for weapon forging. She had a box of bones that no one had ever successfully worked with. Most people would have given up. Most people would have accepted that they were beaten. But Maggie was not most people. She thought about her grandmother again, about all the times Martha Cole had faced impossible situations and found a way through them. Her grandmother had taught her that the easy path was rarely the right one. The things worth doing were almost always difficult. If Void Stalker bone was truly as strong as the database claimed, then a weapon made from it would be superior to anything the other students could create. The only question was whether she could figure out how to forge it. She returned to her workstation and began experimenting. The Academy's standard tools were useless against the bone. Her cutting implements bounced off the surface without leaving a mark. Her heating elements could not raise the material's temperature by even a single degree. But Maggie noticed something interesting. When she applied pressure to the bone in a specific way, holding it at an angle and pushing slowly rather than striking quickly, it seemed to flex ever so slightly. The bone was not completely rigid. It had some give to it. but only under sustained pressure applied in exactly the right manner. She worked through the night, testing different approaches. By morning, she had a theory. The bone could be shaped, but only by combining sustained pressure with carefully controlled heat applied in short pulses. Traditional forging techniques would not work. She would have to invent new techniques. The other students were already well into their projects. Gorthik was forging a massive cleaver from neutron-dense alloy. Valane was weaving pure energy into a blade shape, using her psychic abilities. Every workstation was alive with activity, producing weapons of incredible beauty and power. Maggie looked at her box of bones and her worn-out tools. Then she got to work. The Academy's standard furnaces could not heat void stalker bone. Maggie had tested this repeatedly and confirmed that the material simply absorbed heat without changing temperature. The furnaces were designed for metal alloys, not for organic materials from creatures that lived in the frozen void between stars. So she built her own furnace. She gathered salvaged materials from around the station, discarded heat exchangers from the maintenance bay, chemical compounds from the cleaning supply storage, insulation panels that had been removed during a renovation project. None of these items were meant for forge work, but Maggie had learned something important during her time at the Academy. The rules that governed alien technology were not the same. Rules that governed human ingenuity. Her makeshift furnace was ugly. It looked like a pile of junk held together with tape and determination. The other students pointed and laughed when they saw it. Even Instructor Varric paused his rounds to stare at the strange contraption. "What is that supposed to be?" Gorthik asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "A furnace," Maggie said simply. "It looks like garbage. Most useful things do at first." She activated her creation. The chemical fuel ignited with a roar, producing a flame that burned hotter than anything the Academy furnaces could achieve. The heat was so intense that other students had to back away from their nearby workstations. Warning lights flickered on the ceiling as temperature sensors detected the unusual readings. But Maggie was not trying to heat the bone directly. She had figured out that the Void Stalker material responded to a specific pattern of thermal exposure. Short bursts of extreme heat, followed by periods of cooling, followed by more heat. It was like a rhythm, a heartbeat of fire and ice. When she applied this rhythm to the bone, something remarkable happened. The material began to soften, just slightly, just enough to be worked. It was still incredibly difficult to shape, but it was no longer impossible. Maggie had discovered what 60,000 years of Tervani smithcraft had failed to find. She worked through the first day without stopping. Her human muscles were not built for forge work. The tools were too heavy, the motions too demanding, the heat too intense. By evening, her arms shook with exhaustion and her hands were covered in burns. The Academy Medical Bay was designed for alien species. The treatments available would not work on human physiology. So Maggie wrapped her wounds with strips of cloth torn from her spare clothing and kept working. By the second day, the bone had begun to take shape. She was not making a simple knife or a standard sword. The design she had chosen came from Earth's history, a weapon called a falcata. Our ancestors had used this curved blade to fight against empires. It was a weapon designed for those who were outnumbered and outmatched, a weapon that turned weakness into strength. The shape was perfect for Void Stalker bone. The curve of the blade would concentrate force at the point of impact, maximizing cutting power. The weighted tip would add momentum to every swing. It was a design born from desperation, refined through centuries of human conflict. As she worked, Maggie thought about all the people who had underestimated her. The official who had shown her to a closet instead of a proper room. Instructor Varric, who barely acknowledged her existence. Gorthik and the other students who laughed at her every day. The entire galaxy, which looked at humanity and saw nothing but primitives. She channeled that anger into her work. Every hammer stroke carried the weight of every insult she had endured. Every fold of the bone contained a piece of her fury. The blade was not just a weapon. It was a statement. Humans were not weak. Humans were not primitive. Humans were survivors. The second night passed without sleep. Maggie's vision blurred with exhaustion, but she refused to stop. The bone seemed to respond to her determination. It shaped itself under her tools, as if it recognized the force of her will. By the morning of the third day, she was almost finished. The blade was formed, but it needed an edge and a handle. She had saved the sharpest pieces of bone for the cutting edge, grinding them to a molecular fineness using techniques she had adapted from alien methods. The handle was wrapped in synthetic leather cut from her equipment bag, the last piece of earth she had brought with her. Other students gathered to watch as she completed the final steps. Their mockery had faded into silence. Even Gorthic had stopped laughing. There was something unsettling about what they were witnessing. Something that did not fit their understanding of how the universe worked. A human girl, working with primitive tools and discarded materials, was creating something that none of them could explain. Instructor Varric approached her workstation as she put the finishing touches on the weapon. His scales were a pale shade of blue, indicating surprise and uncertainty. In his decades of teaching, he had never seen anything like this. "You have created something from void stalker bone," he said quietly. "Something that should not be possible." Maggie held up the completed blade. It was beautiful in a savage way, its pale gray surface marked by the natural patterns of the bone. The curve was elegant and deadly. The edge gleamed with a sharpness that seemed almost hungry. "My grandmother taught me that impossible is just another word for difficult," she said. "And difficult has never stopped a human." Varric stared at the blade for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. The examination results would be announced the next day. But Maggie already knew that she had created something special. Whether the judges recognized it or not, she had proven something to herself. She was not inferior. She was not primitive. She was exactly what her grandmother had always told her she was, a survivor. The examination hall was the largest room in the academy, a vast chamber that could hold 1,000 spectators. Today it held only the 40 students of the forging class, their instructors, and a panel of judges who would determine their futures. The walls were lined with display cases showing legendary weapons from throughout history, blades that had shaped the course of galactic civilization. In the center of the hall, tables had been arranged in a circle. Each student's weapon was displayed on its own table, lit by soft lights that highlighted every detail of the craftsmanship. The weapons represented the finest work that young smiths from a dozen worlds could produce. Gorthic's cleaver dominated one section of the display. The massive blade was forged from neutron-dense alloy, material so heavy that normal beings could not lift it. Only a Kreth warrior had the strength to wield such a weapon. The surface was polished to a mirror shine, and the edge was sharp enough to split atoms. Verlaine's energy blade floated on the next table, a sword made of pure light contained within a magnetic field. The Scifistories priestess stood nearby, her translucent body glowing with pride. Her weapon was a masterpiece of psychic engineering, a blade that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Other displays showed crystal swords that sang with harmonic frequencies, plasma-forged daggers that burned with inner fire, and alloy blades folded 1,000 times to create patterns of impossible complexity. Each weapon was a work of art, the product of traditions that spanned tens of thousands of years. And in the far corner of the circle, almost hidden in shadow, stood Maggie's falcata. The bone blade looked primitive compared to its neighbors. It had no glow, no hum of power, no obvious signs of advanced technology. The pale gray surface was marked by natural patterns, and the handle was wrapped in plain leather. To most observers, it looked like something a prehistoric hunter might have carried. Instructor Varric led the panel of judges through the display, stopping at each weapon to examine and evaluate. The judges were masters of their craft, beings who had devoted centuries to the study of weapon forging. They made notes on their tablets and discussed the merits of each piece in low voices. When they reached Gorthic's cleaver, there were nods of approval. When they examined Valaine's energy blade, there were murmurs of admiration. The panel spent several minutes at each display, taking their time to appreciate the skill that had gone into creating these weapons. Then they reached Maggie's table. The lead judge, an ancient Torvani whose scales had faded to white, picked up the falcata. He held it in two hands, feeling the weight and balance. His expression was unreadable. "This is Void Stalkerbone," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "But that is impossible. This material cannot be forged." "I found a way," Maggie said. The judge turned the blade in his hands. He examined the edge, the curve, the construction of the handle. Then he activated the scanner built into his evaluation tablet. The readings that appeared on the screen made him freeze. "The structural density is off the scale," he said slowly. "The molecular bonding is unlike anything in our database. And these resonance patterns..." He looked up at Maggie with an expression of disbelief. "This blade will disrupt energy shields." Silence fell over the examination hall. Energy shields were the foundation of modern galactic defense. They were considered impenetrable by conventional weapons. Every military force in the galaxy relied on them for protection. And this human girl had created a blade that could cut through them. "That cannot be correct," Valaine said, her voice sharp with doubt. "Energy shields are proof against all physical weapons." "It is basic physics." "Then let us test it," the lead judge replied. He led the entire assembly to the testing chamber, a reinforced room designed for weapons evaluation. The walls were made of materials that could withstand starship weapons fire. In the center of the room stood a shield generator, a standard military model used by ground forces throughout the galaxy. The judge activated the shield. A shimmering dome of energy appeared around the generator, glowing with soft blue light. This was the same technology that protected soldiers on battlefields, that defended cities from orbital bombardment, that made modern warfare a contest of shield strength rather than weapon power. "Strike the shield," the judge told Maggie. She stepped forward, the falcata feeling natural in her grip despite its unusual weight. The other students watched with expressions ranging from skepticism to fear. No one believed that a bone blade could penetrate an energy shield. It violated everything they understood about physics and technology. Maggie thought about her grandmother. She thought about her ancestors who had faced impossible odds with nothing but determination and crude weapons. She thought about every human who had ever been told they could not accomplish something and had done it anyway. She swung the blade. The falcata passed through the energy shield without any resistance at all. There was no flash, no explosion, no dramatic effect. The blade simply moved through the barrier as if it did not exist. The energy field flickered once, twice, and then collapsed entirely. The generator sputtered and died. No one spoke. The silence stretched for a long moment as the implications of what they had witnessed sank in. Then the hall erupted into chaos. Gorthic was shouting that it must be a trick. Valaine was demanding that the test be repeated with a stronger shield. Other students were arguing among themselves about what they had seen. Only Instructor Varric remained calm, watching Maggie with an expression she could not read. The lead judge raised his hand for silence. When the noise finally died down, he spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. "In my 300 years of judging weapon examinations," he said, "I've never witnessed anything like this. This blade represents a fundamental breakthrough in material science and weapon design. It challenges assumptions that have guided galactic technology for millennia. He turned to face Maggie directly. How did you accomplish this? Maggie looked at the falcata in her hand, then at the judges, then at the students who had mocked her for months. Humans learn differently than other species, she said. You have 60,000 years of knowledge telling you what is possible and what is not. I only have what I can figure out for myself. So when I found a material that everyone said could not be forged, I did not know I was supposed to fail. She held up the blade, and the light caught its surface in a way that made it seem almost alive. My people call this stubbornness, but I think it is something else. I think it is hope. The hope that no matter how impossible something seems, there might be a way. You just have to be willing to look for it. The results were announced the following morning. Every student in the academy gathered in the main assembly hall, along with faculty members and visiting dignitaries who had heard rumors about what had happened in the testing chamber. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Instructor Varric stood at the podium, his scales shifting through shades of blue and green as he surveyed the crowd. Behind him, a holographic display showed the official rankings of the examination. The advanced class selections have been made, he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. These students demonstrated exceptional skill, creativity, and understanding of the smith's art. He began reading names from the bottom of the list. Third-tier placements went to students who had shown competence, but nothing remarkable. Second-tier placements recognized those who had pushed beyond the basics. First tier, the advanced class itself, was reserved for the truly exceptional. First-tier selections, Varric announced. Studying under Grandmaster Torin himself, he read several names. Gorthic's name was not among them. The Kreth warrior's face darkened with anger and humiliation. His neutron cleaver had been impressive, but it was ultimately just a refinement of existing techniques. Nothing new, nothing breakthrough. Valaine's name was called, and the Silithy priestess allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Her energy blade had earned its place among the elite. Then Varric paused. His eyes found Maggie in the crowd. Top placement in the advanced class, he said slowly, as if the words were difficult to speak. Highest marks in the history of this examination. Maggie Cole, representing humanity. The hall erupted. Some students shouted in protest, others in surprise, others in what might have been admiration. Dignitaries whispered urgently to each other. Faculty members exchanged glances in disbelief. Maggie walked to the front of the hall to accept her certification. The document was written in the formal script of the Torvani, but a human translation had been added below. It certified her as a first-tier student of the Academy of Martial Sciences, entitled to study under the greatest living master of the Forged Art. As she took the document, a figure emerged from behind the podium. He was ancient even by Tovani standards. His scales faded to pure silver, his movements slow but deliberate. This was Grandmaster Torin, the legendary smith whose works were studied throughout the galaxy. I asked to speak with you personally, Torin said, his voice soft but clear. I have examined your blade. I have studied your techniques. And I have a question. Maggie waited. Why bones? Torin asked. Of all the materials available to you, even the rejected scraps, you chose the one substance that has defeated every smith in galactic history. Why? Maggie considered the question carefully before answering. Because everyone else had given up on it. They decided it was impossible and moved on to easier materials. But I did not have that luxury. The easy materials were already taken. I had to work with what was left. And you were not afraid of failure? I was terrified of failure, Maggie admitted. But fear is not a reason to stop. It is just another obstacle to overcome. My grandmother taught me that. Torin was silent for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked everyone in the hall. He bowed to her, a gesture of deep respect that master smiths reserve for equals. "Your species is young," he said as he straightened. "You have only known technology for a fraction of the time that older civilizations have existed. May see this as a weakness. They believe humans have nothing to offer the galaxy." He gestured at the blade that hung at Maggie's side. "They are wrong. What you have demonstrated is not just skill or knowledge. It is something far more valuable. You have shown the willingness to attempt the impossible, the courage to fail, and the determination to keep trying until you succeed. These qualities have been bred out of most advanced species. We have become so accustomed to our knowledge that we have forgotten how to learn." Torin turned to address the entire hall. "Let this serve as a lesson to all of you. The measure of a smith is not the tools they possess or the materials they work with. It is the fire in their spirit, the refusal to accept defeat, the ability to see possibilities where others see only obstacles." He looked back at Maggie. "Humanity may be young, but they carry something ancient within them, something that the galaxy has nearly lost. They remind us of what we once were, before we became comfortable, before we stopped reaching for the impossible." In the weeks that followed, Maggie's achievements spread throughout the galactic community. Scientists requested permission to study her forging techniques. Military leaders discussed the implications of weapons that could penetrate energy shields. Politicians debated whether humanity was ready for full membership in the Interstellar Council. But Maggie paid little attention to any of this. She was too busy working on her next project. The Falcata had been just the beginning. Now she was developing armor made from the same void stalker bone, a suit that would protect its wearer from weapons that could destroy starships. The design was based on ancient Earth patterns, updated with techniques she had learned from studying alien traditions. Instructor Varek visited her workstation one evening as she labored over her new creation. His attitude toward her had changed completely since the examination. He no longer ignored her or looked at her with contempt. Instead, there was something like respect in his eyes. "Why do you push yourself so hard?" he asked. "You have already achieved more than any human before you. You could rest on your success." Maggie looked up from her work. Her hands were burned and calloused, her eyes tired from long hours of effort. But there was a fire in her gaze that made even the veteran instructor take a step back. "Because somewhere out there is another human who will arrive at an academy like this one," she said. "Someone who will be given a closet for a room and rejected scraps for materials. Someone who will be told they cannot succeed because they are human." She turned back to her armor, her hammer striking the bone in steady rhythm. "I want that person to know that impossible is just a word. And words have never stopped us." Years later, when Maggie Cole became the first human to earn the title of Grandmaster Smith, her original Falcata was placed in the Academy's museum. Students from across the galaxy came to see it. The blade forged from bone and fury that had changed how the universe saw humanity. The plaque beneath the display read simply, "Let all who see this blade remember, humans do not accept impossible." And in a small frame beside the plaque was a photograph of an elderly woman with kind eyes and a determined jaw. Martha Cole, grandmother of a grandmaster, who had taught her granddaughter the most important lesson of all: never give up. Never surrender. Never let anyone tell you what you cannot do. That is what survivors do.